Hi, I'm Jason Mojica, Editor-in-Chief of Vice News, and this is Emphasis Added, a show where we take a look at how the media impact the stories they cover. Today, our topic is coverage of the Islamic State, aka ISIS, aka ISIL. The group stormed into Iraq from Syria last summer and proclaimed that they had established a caliphate, inviting people from around the world to join them. Their actions grabbed headline after headline and inspired countless hours of television news coverage. But is the way that the Islamic State is covered actually inflating their status and causing their ranks to swell? Are the near-daily news stories putting pressure on politicians to wipe the group out, or does breathless reporting about the group's brutality actually give governments the freedom to engage in actions they've been wanting to take for a very, very long time? To answer these questions and many more, we have with us Stephen Livingston, Professor of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University, Santiago Lyon, Vice President and Director of Photography at the Associated Press. And coming to us via Skype from London, we're joined by Lina Khatib. She's the Director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. And last but not least, from Paris, we have Phil Chetwynd, who is the Editor-in-Chief at AFP. If you have any questions for our guests throughout this program, you can tweet them at Vice News with the hashtag #EmphasisAdded. So my first question, and this goes to all of you, I'd like a simple yes or no. Does the Islamic State deserve the level of coverage it's getting? Santiago.
Well, I suppose it depends what they do. We base our coverage decisions, and the media in general, I think, bases their coverage decisions on the newsworthiness of events, of people in the news. So if they do things that are newsworthy, they will get coverage. If they don't, they will not.
I will come back to you with a definition of what is and is not newsworthy for a better definition of that. Stephen?
Yeah, actually, that's a good place for me to pick up. I mean, what is newsworthy is a very complicated issue. There are violent events occurring all the time, all over the world. Mm-hmm. Only a small fraction of them receive any sort of attention, any sort of news coverage at all. I'm not sure it's the value of the event that drives it. There are other factors that are driving it, and I think that's where the interesting questions lie.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Khatib?
Well, it's not that they deserve it or not. It's about everything else that is also happening in Syria and whether all those things are getting the attention they deserve, such as the brutality of the Assad regime, the rise of other jihadist groups in Syria. So the story seems to focus on ISIS, but ISIS is not the full story.
Mm-hmm. And Phil?
I would broadly agree that the scale of coverage of the Islamic State is justified, given, I think, the breadth of events linked to the Islamic State. Now you're seeing it linked to events in Tunisia, you're seeing it linked to Libya, Nigeria, and of course events in Europe. So I think once you take those global trends into consideration, this is really a phenomenon that needs serious consideration and serious explanation.
Mm-hmm. But that expansion that you talk about, I wonder if those of us here who work in media, are we part of the problem? Is it our coverage that is leading to its expansion? Santiago.
It's a good question. I mean, it's the chicken and the egg question, right? Which comes first, the events and then we cover them, or the coverage and then more events? I think it really depends on what is going on. I mean, we react to certain news events, but we don't react to all news events equally, as Steve pointed out. Mm-hmm. There are things happening all over the world that don't merit coverage, either because there aren't enough media resources to cover those things, or other events take priority, and there's a sort of a hierarchy of media events in any given day. A big story will knock off a smaller story out of the news on occasion. So it's complicated. There's never, in my experience, any one-size-fits-all rule. You take a look at every day and you gauge your priorities and you gauge your areas of focus based on what's going on that day. I think what we've seen, of course, in recent years is this tremendous acceleration of volume and speed of information coming from all over the world. Everybody who has access to social media is, in effect, a publisher now. And media organizations themselves are enhancing the breadth and depth of their reach through social media, but it's not just limited to media organizations. Governments are tweeting and restricting access in order to bypass traditional media, get their own message out on their own terms. Companies are doing it, military are doing it, sports teams are doing it, celebrities are doing it. everybody who was previously obliged to some degree to interact with the traditional media in order to reach the audiences now has their own path to do that. And that, of course, extends to organizations like the Islamic State, who have a very sophisticated social media presence.
Well, but let's go back a bit and talk about, when we talk about coverage of the Islamic State, when we talk about reporting on the Islamic State, what does that even mean when it's next to impossible to get a reporter into the area that they control? I mean, and so basically, you know, in the absence of independent and reliable reporting from the ground, what are the raw materials that we have to work with, Stephen?
Yeah. Well, you know, this is something, your question really calls to mind something that Santiago said a moment ago that is one of the key determinants as to what constitutes a news story. There are events going on all over the world, but the media resources aren't present to turn them into news, which then raises the question, there aren't the resources in ISIS-controlled territory. As you pointed out, you can't get a reporter there to cover the events. So then the question becomes, well, what are the resources? Well, the resources of ISIS itself, which is very, very sophisticated with its production of its gruesome videos released according to the news cycles of the markets that they're most trying to affect, with the kind of narrative grammar, visual grammar that one would expect to find from the most sophisticated news production facilities. And not only that, but very interestingly, it seems, at least if you listen to some of the reports coming out of Brookings and elsewhere, even very subtle sort of cultural references cued into an audience that will have watched a movie like Saw or Hostel. And there are visual echoes in the ISIS videos that are being drawn from these popular culture entertainments. So my point here is that there may not be the Western news resources there, but ISIS is doing everything it can to appeal to fill in that vacuum on their own. And this leads news organizations to confront a dilemma. How much of the ISIS-produced material do you use? How much do you not? And it seems to me that, as far as I can tell, there's a variety of opinions on that matter.
I can sense Lena and Phil very eager to jump in here. And so, you know, first to Lena, how would you characterize the media arm of the Islamic State?
Highly sophisticated, tightly controlled from the top so as to minimize mistakes. Meaning, if we compare what Al-Qaeda used to do, almost any member of Al-Qaeda was able to post things on Facebook or create content for online consumption, regardless of what the top leadership wanted in terms of specific messages. As long as it was more or less in line with Al-Qaeda ideology, it was okay. With ISIS, it's a very different model. There's a media department that tightly controls messages. So, for example, when new fighters join ISIS, if they are well known and they have Twitter accounts, they are made to hand over their passwords to ISIS Central. And then every tweet that is disseminated is tightly controlled by the media department. So it's about minimizing mistakes that might expose ISIS. And one incident happened in Syria last year with Jabhat al-Nusra. A sympathizer posted, because he was very excited, on Facebook in March of last year, details about a particular movement of military vehicles by Jabhat al-Nusra. And of course, this led to an attack by ISIS as well as the Syrian regime on that particular military convoy, because the details were revealed by the sympathizer on Facebook. So ISIS, for strategic military purposes, not just propaganda purposes, has a very tight grip on how messages are disseminated and for what purpose.
Right. I want to ask Phil about, those messages. Can you talk to us a bit about AFP's approach to reporting on the Islamic State and, working, how do you report on the Islamic State when you have so little to work with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things to stress, which Santiago has touched on as well, is that a lot of Western media, and ourselves included, are in really uncharted territory here. There are very few conflicts, however difficult, of the last 10, 15 years that we haven't been there. People were in Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever it may be, difficult, dangerous, yes, but this is really something, different and new. The threats to any journalist on the ground are so huge that really we cannot be there. So how do we do that? We have to look for the sources that we have, be it activist sources, be it witnesses coming out from those areas, and of course, being it a very sophisticated media operation from ISIS. One of the things, of course, that our editors and people in the Middle East who follow this very carefully find is how credible actually the information put out by ISIS sources is. They don't exaggerate, for example, military gains. When they say they've taken an area or so on, it turns out largely that this is correct. They've realized it's reasonably sophisticated in realizing that their credibility comes from putting out, behind the propaganda, reasonably factually correct information. So it's a very imperfect patchwork of information, and sure, we are not getting the full story, of course.
I wonder if they have a standards and practices manual.
Well, they plainly have organization behind it where they are able to control how people work and how they put out information. It's sophisticated and it's effective, it has to be said.
Well, one of the things that I was very struck by was their use of the British hostage John Cantley, photojournalist who was abducted along with Jim Foley, I believe. He's done a number of sort of reports for the Islamic State. And there was one that he did from Kobani, the town that was on the Turkish border there that was under siege, where they had taken him, it appeared, to Kobani, and he was reporting from the Islamic State-controlled areas of Kobani, at least from what you could see in the video of the physical, the terrain and the Turkish flags, etc. And he was making claims that were clearly not true, that the Islamic State was in control of Kobani, was not going to lose Kobani. And that was interesting for me because to the point that was just made, it was taking the propaganda one step further and saying things that were clearly not true, whereas previously they had been quite measured about what they were saying and quite factual about what they were saying. So it made me wonder, how do they, well, first of all, the use of a British journalist to be the public face and the way that he appeared. I mean, he did a very convincing impersonation of a television news correspondent.
Sure, yeah, for those not familiar, I mean, while Islamic State has released a number of videos featuring beheadings of foreign journalists, John Cantley is a British journalist who is being held by the Islamic State, and they've been releasing a series of videos that feature him basically as a correspondent. And I'm curious to ask both about the graphic videos we've just mentioned, but also how did the Associated Press handle the Cantley videos?
The Cantley videos initially, when they first came out, I believe we used some frame grabs. I think the first videos, it was him in a darkened room wearing an orange costume at a table. I think we used those because we felt there was news value in the fact that he was reporting on things for the Islamic State. Subsequent videos we didn't use. We didn't use any of the video. We didn't use any frame grabs because we felt that that was more pure propaganda and we didn't feel the need to sort of perpetuate that. But it does raise the broader question, which I think has been touched on, is what is the role of the media in reporting Islamic State activities? To what degree should we serve as an amplifier or a loudspeaker for what they do? And we take it at the AP on a case-by-case basis and look at each piece of content and make a determination. For example, with the video showing the beheadings and murders of the other captives, we determined that we did not want to show the moment of death out of respect for the victim. We did want to show the hostage with their captor, but we didn't want to show the hostage being threatened with a knife at the throat or a knife raised, because we felt that we didn't want to give this more attention than it deserved. And as a result, what we chose to do, and we've been fairly consistent with this through all these videos, is to have one frame grab from the video that does not show the moment of death, that does show the captive, that does show the captor, and we leave it at that. And that's all that we show visually.
Just one second. Let's take a quick look at how Sky News covered the video, the beheading of James Foley.
James Foley was kidnapped in Syria in November 2012, but it wasn't the first time he'd been detained. He was taken by pro-Gaddafi forces in Libya several years earlier and spent months in jail. When he returned after 6 weeks, he reflected on the risks of reporting from war zones.
We hitched a ride up to the front lines, and we were told that Gaddafi forces were very close. We decided to get off the road because we felt it was safer due to normally shelling coming from the road. Unfortunately, Gaddafi forces came right over the hill, and within seconds we were under heavy fire.
He was soon back in the field in Syria, recording the suffering of innocents in war, until he was kidnapped.
Yeah, so we may have missed the beginning of the clip where Sky kind of explained that they were not going to show the footage. They didn't even show a freeze frame from the video. They instead layered over a video of James doing the work that he loved. So I understand the impulse that, you know, as journalists we may not want to carry water for organizations, but if when we shy away from showing the brutality of groups, is that also doing a disservice to the public, to be able to fully understand what this group is all about, what this group is engaged in? Lena?
Well, I think you have to have a bit of both, but there's no formula that tells you the exact percentage of how much brutality you should show and how much you should withhold. But I lean towards saying we should not become a platform for ISIS, because, you see, ISIS is a claimed state that's not really a state, it's a terrorist organization, and does not have a single ally in the world. Not a single country in the world is allied with this entity, which means ISIS cannot establish its own media channels in the mainstream. It cannot have a satellite television channel, for example. So in order to recruit new fighters, ISIS has to rely on the media in the West as well as the Middle East to carry its messages. So we have to be careful about disseminating these messages, because we might just become tools in the hands of ISIS as it seeks to affirm that it is indeed powerful and influential. But I want to add one thing, following up on what Santiago mentioned earlier, which I think is important to emphasize. ISIS uses media propaganda to compensate for military losses. This explains the Cantley videos. This explains the video of the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, giving his sermon on Mosul. The Islamic State as a state was declared, meaning the Caliphate, was declared in June of last year when ISIS found that it could not expand anymore geographically in Iraq. So it had to compensate for this geographical challenge and military challenge through creating a huge stir in terms of media and propaganda.
Yeah, Lena, they have created a huge stir and gotten a lot of attention, and kind of the graphic nature of their videos and the things that they're actually doing on the ground certainly is, I think we've all decided, very newsworthy. So I want to talk about how the media choose to cover these stories, how they frame these events. And Stephen, can you talk to us a bit from where you're sitting, how are you seeing the Islamic State covered? What frames are being used, and what are the effects of those things?
Well, actually, for me, one of the things that's most interesting is it depends upon what you mean by media, because one of the big impact areas has to do actually with the use of Twitter by ISIS. A study found that between September and December of 2014, there were anywhere between 40 to 70,000 regular Twitter accounts being used by ISIS supporters. Of those, a very small percentage, somewhere in the hundreds, were really strong users tweeting a lot every day. But what was most interesting is, of those, let's use the lower end, the 40,000 Twitter accounts that were sympathetic with ISIS, either ISIS or sympathetic to ISIS, they had on average an extraordinary number of followers, 1,000 or more followers. So, here it isn't the question of how is the AP or how is some other news organization that we're used to turning to for our daily news, in the newspaper, et cetera, but rather those people who are inclined to be sympathetic with ISIS anyway are followers. And they're getting the news that ISIS wants them to get, the information that they want them to get, bypassing the traditional media altogether. And that, I think, needs to be brought into the conversation as well. Let me add one other thing, though, too. We're stepping back just a second. Your question was, how are the news organizations in the West managing the images? Well, what is interesting is that so is ISIS managing the images. In September of last year, it seems that Twitter was just shutting down accounts as fast as they could that they identified as ISIS accounts, but they already had spare accounts already set up, ready to go as soon as the account they were using was shut down. They had another one to line up. That's all well and good. But what was really interesting is the use of Vine, the video clipping service. ISIS, it seems, was learning from the experience of being shut down. They're taking the video image right up to the point of the killing, of the beheading, but not showing the beheading because they calculated that doing so would somehow allow their site to remain untouched for a longer period of time. The emotional impact was there. They just didn't take that extra step and actually show the killing itself. So it's, I think, just as important for us to think about these other dimensions of this battle for the agenda, the battle for the frame, that goes well beyond what we might see in our newspaper or on our televisions.
Yeah, Phil, speaking to that emotional impact, and I'd like to kind of turn things a bit to the role of media coverage of the Islamic State in recruitment. I'm sure this is a hot topic in France following the Charlie Hebdo attacks. I mean, how do the folks in your office reconcile the fact that reporting on the Islamic State, on its very dramatic actions that tend to make people stand up and take notice, may inspiring some young person to want to go join that group?
Well, I think I would touch on the point just made. I mean, I think there's broad agreement now amongst a lot of Western media organizations to really raise the bar very high in terms of what content from ISIS we use. We use very little. I think of all the execution videos, we didn't use a single video. We may have used the odd frame grab, which we thought was necessary. There's a movement among the international media to make a huge effort to find alternative images of, for example, people involved in hostage videos, as we saw there with Sky News, to find images of them in their everyday life. So I think that there's already, that is one of the major responses to this flood of ISIS propaganda images. Aside from that, in terms of the daily threats and so on that come out from ISIS to attack various interests around the world, again, I think we're very aware of the responsibility we have in terms of amplifying that. We have a lot of discussions day by day where you hear, oh, we're going to attack various targets in the States. We're going to attack various targets in Europe. And really, unless we can justify it for some very important contextual news reason, we tend to hold back on that. Having said that, there was an example recently where we held back from that, and then the US Department of Homeland Security came out with a statement to amplify the claim. So naturally, it then got widely disseminated. So it's not always literally the media taking the decision or not. It also depends on how governments around the world are reacting too.
Yeah, definitely. Lena, any thoughts on that?
I just want to refer to a case going on in Lebanon at the moment as an example, which is that Lebanese soldiers have been held hostage by ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra for quite a few months now. And unfortunately, Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS are phoning the families of the hostages, telling them that if you don't go out in the street and demonstrate against basically the holding of your children, we are going to kill them.
That's
now there's a protest.
That's confirmed?
This is happening right outside my office in Beirut. There's now a permanent or open-ended protest camp by the parents of these soldiers, demanding, asking the Lebanese government to do something about them, basically. And they keep getting calls regularly. And there are media vans camped out almost permanently in the area, recording every single movement by these parents. And they are being used as tools by Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS to keep them in the news, basically. So this is a situation where I think the media are failing, and the Lebanese government obviously is failing. And this means that there has to be
from recruitment, right? Because one of the strong issues here is recruitment, and at the same time, if you look at a lot of these high-profile cases that we've had in Europe recently of these young teenagers and various other people going off to Syria without their families knowing. This did not come through the official, mainstream media. This was real grooming and recruitment through all the social network tools that we've just been talking about. So I think on the specific issue of recruitment, I think that's a different issue from raising the price of a hostage by forcing people, which I agree with you on that point. But those are slightly separate issues, I think.
Yeah, sure.
No, I think they are connected, actually, if I may, because when ISIS does this, it is showing itself as influential. It is showing itself as being able to humiliate governments. And this makes it more attractive in the eyes of new recruits.
Well, yeah, let's move. I mean, they certainly are having an influence. And actually, let's move off of recruitment onto something that I think is very important, is basically the role of media coverage of the Islamic State in either pressuring governments to take action against them, ironically, or the way the breathless coverage of this terrible, terrible group that must be eliminated. Does that really just kind of give governments around the world an excuse to do some things they've been wanting to do for a long time? This has been a pet peeve of mine for a very long time. I've written about this, and that this is my point, that one of the things that I think that a lot of news organizations aren't doing, I think in part because of the nature of the day-to-day news cycle, is taking a step back and trying to untangle the degree to which so many of the conflicts, whether we're looking at the military operations in Yemen with the Saudis today, or if we're looking now at American airstrikes into Crete, is that we have proxy wars going on between Sunni and Shia Islam that the typical American, anyway, probably hasn't even a start of a clue as to how to unravel. I mean, the idea that while the Republicans in the Senate are sending letters to Iran about the Iranian nuclear weapons deal, the United States is essentially a military ally right now with the Quds force in Tikrit. So unraveling all of that and making some sort of sense of that, if it can be made sense of, would be, I think, one of the first steps in trying to understand the geopolitical consequences and dynamics that I think your question is really getting at. Mm-hmm. How do you understand something as complex as it used to be my enemy's enemy is my friend? Well, that doesn't even apply, it seems, in this particular instance. It's almost quantum. Enemy creation, where a friend can be a friend and an enemy at the same time. Getting through that would be so helpful, I think, for so many people around the world who don't have the time or the inclination or the background to try to sort that out. Yeah. Lena, what I don't want to... Actually, real quick, I want to go back. There is a clip of basically when the Islamic State, or then ISIS, first stormed into Iraq. I just want to look at some of the first coverage that we saw on mainstream media, and looking back, now that everyone's become some sort of Islamic State expert, this looks kind of quaint in its simplicity. Can we roll that?
With the lightning advance of ISIS in Iraq, President Obama's foreign policy may be under attack like never before. I want to put up this poll. In a Wall Street Journal poll this week, approval of Obama's handling of foreign policy hit a new low of just 37%.
That wasn't quite the clip I was looking for. This is our first show, if you haven't noticed. But there's another clip, though, of John McCain days after. And he kind of went straight to Congress, and kind of, it seemed like he had it all worked out, and he had a plan.
Well, John McCain always has a plan.
Well, let's see what he had to say.
Because the President of the United States declares a conflict over does not mean in the eyes of the enemy that it's over. Conflicts end when the enemy is defeated. The Iraq War did not end because the forces against Iraq were still, and within Iraq, were still undefeated. I say to the President of the United States, get a new national security team in place. You have been ill-served by the national security team and the decisions that you have in place now and the decisions that you made. and have that new national security team come up with a strategy to do whatever we can to prevent this direct threat to the national security of this nation, the security of this nation.
And he goes on to shift the conversation to how we ought to make sure to keep troops in Afghanistan, and you know that's the lesson to learn from all of this. Lena, how is coverage of the Islamic State affecting the actions of the Lebanese government?
Well, first of all, unfortunately, there is no Lebanese government.
And by Lebanese government, I mean Hezbollah.
No. What I mean is, at the moment in Lebanon, there's only a caretaker cabinet and no president, and a parliament that has extended its own mandate illegally. But that's a separate issue. The issue is, in Lebanon, because of this political vacuum, the government is unable to do much. For example, normally, if you are an army and certain soldiers are kidnapped by a terrorist entity, normally what happens is you attack, you try to get them back. But Lebanon does not have the commander-in-chief in place because that is the president, and there is no president in Lebanon at the moment. So the political stalemate in Lebanon is actually allowing ISIS to continue with Jabhat al-Nusra, to toy with the families of the recruits. And Jabhat al-Nusra, in fact, is gaining more and more recruits in Lebanon, partly as a result of this. It's not, of course, the only reason why certain people are turning to Jabhat al-Nusra, but this does play a role. When you are a marginalized person looking at an entity that seems to be stronger than governments, this becomes relatively attractive to quite a few people.
And Phil, do you get a sense that, especially in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, that the French government is pressured not only by actions, but by the media attention to these events to do something about it?
Well, I think not just the French government, but I think governments in Europe are really feeling the pressure of the backlash from events in Syria in the last 4 or 5 years. You're talking about the sheer quantity of people who've gone from Europe to Syria to be either to the Islamic State or even to fight with other groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra, and the quantity of people returning. The intelligence agencies will openly say they cannot keep up with the monitoring of these vast numbers of people. So in that sense, I think that the fears that come from that number of people now across Europe are very real. We've had attacks in Brussels, we've had attacks in Paris, and I think most analysts would expect there to be more attacks. So I think, those are quite concrete things. They're not sort of just fears that have been fanned by media attention.
Santiago, the Associated Press is gigantic. I mean, when you report on things, it gets picked up by papers all around the world. What would happen if the Associated Press decided to not cover the Islamic State? Has it ever been even crossed anyone's mind? Is that anathema to the entire concept of your organization?
Well, we don't make decisions like that, blanket decisions not to cover something in its entirety. We're driven by what we perceive as interest or the actions of others or news value or things like that. I think the question that I'm interested in, there's probably no way to get an answer, but the Islamic State has made it clear that they view journalists as hostage material, and hostage material that many Western governments are willing to pay significant sums of money for. And it is, as I understand it, a significant stream of income for the organization. And for those governments that aren't prepared to pay, like the US or the UK governments, then it has a certain propaganda value for them in terms of beheading. But I think that the part of it that I don't quite understand is what would happen if the Islamic State did let media in, as they have done on occasion. Vice were able to get into their territory. A German author and journalist was able to get into their territory. You would think that if an organization that wanted to control public perception would not just purely rely on their own propaganda machine, but that would try and let the media in the same way that at the beginning of the Syrian conflict, media organizations could report around Jabhat al-Nusra and other organizations. There was a sort of an understanding that if we let the media in, well, they'll tell our side of the story. It may or may not be useful, but at least it's another window on activities. Yeah. That's not happening, and that strikes me as being interesting.
You've hit on something very interesting there, though, which is not the coverage of the Islamic State per se affecting the outcome of events, but the actual organizations and their practices, i.e. sending journalists to cover it, and they end up getting kidnapped, they end up being ransomed, they end up being a source of income for the Islamic State. So that's very interesting in and of itself, but I guess secondly is, are we exacerbating that when news organizations fail to cover kidnappings? When we engage in media blackouts about kidnappings, does that just open the door for that to continue happening? Or, I mean, I'm curious about your take, yeah. Phil? Well, Phil's in a stickier position regarding this than Lena, so I'm going to go to Phil first.
Sure. I mean, I think the discussion, which has been very lively about should you enforce blackouts on kidnappings or should you publicize them, I think, frankly, it's only after each individual case of kidnapping where you'll sometimes find out what was the right policy to do. There are clearly situations, notably involving ransoms and so on, where the publicity raises the value of the hostage. There are certainly other situations where perhaps a home government, may wish to keep something quiet for various reasons, and it's in the interest of the family to publicize that and make the government act. So I think there are arguments on both sides of that, and it very much depends on the context of the individual kidnapping. On the issue of ransoms, I think intellectually everybody can understand the whole idea of not paying ransoms to terrorist groups or to militant groups, whatever you want to call them. At the same time, of course, everybody can also understand the human problem or the human tragedy when a family is faced with trying to save their loved one, wherever that may be, and the only option out is through some kind of ransom. So, and those two things are not really reconcilable, I think.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, Lena, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, because I spoke to some hostage negotiators who have worked with ISIS, and they said that media blackouts are very important because of the raising of the value of hostages. But more importantly, there doesn't seem to be a coherent strategy among countries belonging to the international coalition fighting ISIS at the moment regarding hostages. And it is not helpful when some countries pay ransoms and some countries don't pay ransoms. And also when there is no support mechanism in place for the families of hostages. And that's why we get so many videos of parents pleading and crying, and then their sons and daughters get killed afterwards. So this is a key thing. It's not, it's about the responsibility of governments in dealing with this kind of situation. The other issue.
Sorry, if I could just say on that, the one thing I would just say is that governments have very, very different policies, even within Europe, of how they deal with families. And I've seen that when you're dealing with an American family and a British family, and the way the governments interact with them is totally, totally different.
Yeah, those videos that Lena's talking about, those videos.
This is not helping. But the lack of coherence is playing right into the hands of ISIS.
Yeah, those videos that you speak about, Lena, of crying families, that of course also has to have an impact on people who are hoping that someone will cast a vote for them next time around. So, very interesting. I think maybe we should take a few questions now from the Twitterverse. What do we have? So, questions and or comments and or criticisms, perhaps even of our performance here today. So let's see what we have here from the elegantly named 7E55E. Everything should always be shown, even if we don't like it. It's called freedom. The only way. Well, there we go. So what about that? What about freedom? What about freedom? You, gatekeeper of the media, decider of what we should and should not see.
But that's the point, I think, is that the media is no longer the exclusive gatekeeper. The media used to have this role because technology wasn't as advanced as it is today, and so the only source of information for many people was either the newspaper or the radio or the television broadcast. Now that's just not the case. And in fact, when people want to find these videos, they can find them. It's a game of cat and mouse with, providers taking them down and Islamic State putting them back up, as has been made note of. But people who are really determined to find these videos can find them. And there are sites that aggregate them actively and make a business out of showing, horrific videos from around the world of a wide variety of things, traffic accidents as well as beheadings. So I'm not sure that that the media, or I would say more definitively, the media does not have the role that it once had. It does, however, I think, have an important role, which is that of validating and verifying information to the best of its ability so that people who are discerning and want to know if they can believe something can go to a media source that they trust and know that what they are learning from that media source has been validated and verified. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting example there. For example, the Associated Press does use video provided to you by activist organizations, human rights organizations, who admittedly have a goal. They're advocacy groups,
right.
But you presumably find their information valuable.
We look at their information, we try and validate it, we try and put it into context. I mean, there's an interesting dynamic in the media world that's been going on for several years now, which is, something will happen, an atrocity will occur someplace remotely. The media will go cover that for a period of time and then pull out as they move on to other things. Human rights organizations will then go in and do a more detailed level of forensic reporting about the events and release a sort of a comprehensive report calling the authorities to account. And then the media will go back in and report on that report. So it's the sort of circular dynamic of activist organizations and media organizations in response to events on the ground. And that's just an example of how rapidly things are changing. I mean, when we compare this current media environment to the media environment of just 5 years ago, now there's huge synergy between social networks. You can feed Twitter from Facebook and vice versa, and Instagram, and this sort of enhanced activity. When you look at social media interaction around major events like sporting events, World Cup soccer, for example, or Olympic Games, huge engagement with the public, which really, has an effect on how people receive their information and obviously has an effect on how the traditional media do their jobs.
Yeah, great. And here's another question from Kai. He asks, how detrimental is the Western media's coverage on the Islamic State propaganda to Muslims living in the U.S.? I mean, or maybe not even just living in the U.S. What about Islamophobia? When you're covering this organization that dubs itself the Islamic State, which is a very presumptuous title. Lena, thoughts?
Okay. It is definitely adding to tensions, not just when it comes to Muslims in the West and Islamophobia, but also sectarian tensions in the Middle East, which is right now reaching breaking point in a number of places. Yemen is falling apart, Iraq is falling apart, Syria is falling apart, Lebanon is becoming very tense, etc. So I think we should not underestimate the impact of ISIS propaganda internally in the Middle East, and this in turn, of course, has spillovers around the world.
Phil, do you get many complaints about your coverage of the Islamic State?
Yeah, I think it's a topic that's discussed a lot, both internally and externally, and something that we've discussed a lot here in trying to frame it properly. For example, and also with our colleagues, it should be pointed out, with the Associated Press, with Reuters, with other big media organizations. There was a lot of discussion about what we call the group. We went into a big consultation about that. We settled on calling it the Islamic State group, so as not to the idea of actually getting away from just calling it the Islamic State and giving the impression it's a country. It's a compromise. Other people wanted to call it Daesh like they do in the Middle East, but again, we felt that in the Western media, in the Western world, that didn't really mean anything. It wasn't something that really resonated with people. So yeah, there's a tremendous amount of debate about this, and I think that there aren't necessarily any easy solutions from it.
Here's a question from Peter Sellier. He can call me and correct me on that. I welcome that. What role will a counter-media response to ISIS propaganda play in addition to ongoing military responses? And I'll throw that out to anyone who wants to jump on it.
If Peter has an idea as to what an effective counter-media response it would even be, I think there are people in Washington where I live that would like to hear from him. This is not going to be a campaign that's going to look like just say no to drugs. I mean, you know, some sort of soft response to media messages that come with so much emotional impact is so hard to figure out how to respond to in the first place that I'm not sure what the counter-media response even looks like in the first place.
But that program does exist. The U.S. State Department does have a Twitter account.
Have you seen it?
Think Again, Turn Away. I have seen it. What are your thoughts on that?
Maybe it's just I'm cynical or something. I've lived in Washington too long or next to the State Department. I don't think it's going to be very persuasive. I mean, first of all, going back to what we were saying, it isn't just the mainstream media. It's Twitter and other ways of messages going to people who are already perhaps sort of on the edge, curious about feeling alienated, disaffected in their home country. So reaching those people with an effective counter message, even identifying them, because so much of the followership is self-identified, right? You are saying I am interested in this line of reasoning, these events, what they're doing. So even reaching the right people with a Twitter feed is going to be next to impossible. I don't see somebody who's inclined to be a follower of ISIS also electing to follow and pay attention to what the State Department is saying.
Yeah, I remember.
Maybe I'm wrong in that.
I remember a few months back seeing a tweet from the Think Again, Turn Away State Department account that was a visual side-by-side comparing an Islamic State atrocity to an image of the Holocaust, in which Nazis had just executed a number of folks there, and I found it kind of confusing that they were trying to shame the Islamic State by comparing them to an organization that killed millions of Jews.
Yeah.
Seemed a little counterintuitive to me.
Was that thought through?
Yeah. Do we have a Skype question, comment? No, we have no Skype questions or comments. That's no fault of Skype. Anything anyone would like to add? Have we solved it all? Have we fixed
Can we back
all of
up
the
for a
problems?
minute?
Yeah,
One
please.
of the responses, maybe I missed it or something, but you had asked a question earlier, what about national responses to all of this? Yeah. And I don't remember us saying anything about the American military response. And what's so interesting about the American military response is it's just as much in the shadows as so much of what ISIS is doing. In other words, Western reporters can't get in to cover ISIS, but neither can they cover what the American military are doing in response. There are no boots on the ground that are at least objectively observable. Instead, they're drone attacks. They're attacks from the air that are notoriously difficult for you to even know about, much less cover in any sort of meaningful way. So much of what we're looking at with this conflict is going on behind the scenes. So a lot of what we've been talking about is what's up on the front stage, right? What are the players saying up front when a lot of what's going on in a meaningful sense is occurring off stage. It's going on someplace else. That is the story that really needs to be somehow told. But then the question becomes, how do my journalism professionals around me here actually get to that? Could I have...
I would agree with that. I mean, I think what was very interesting is just around the time that everything was happening around Mosul and the fall of Mosul was really also the Israeli-Gaza war was going on. And there you're talking about access. Yes. And suddenly what was a relatively, of course, it was a significant conflict and there was significant civilian loss of life and so on, but still a relatively contained conflict in that sense. It was really, of course, knocked the Iraq story completely off the airways and off the front pages because of access. Of course, the Israelis allowed journalists into Gaza, and people like ourselves and the Associated Press had people within Gaza. And so the conflict was covered in great detail on both sides, on both the Israeli and Gaza side. And that's really about access, isn't it?
Well, could I have 30 seconds to
Please.
very, and so what I'm seeing from my vantage point is news organizations, whether it be the New York Times or others, are starting to use newer technologies that we haven't talked about to sort of get is it access? But, I'm thinking of Digital Globe's Worldview 3 satellite that has essentially 12-inch spatial resolution, and you can take pictures from space of the destruction of conflicts or even of the emergence of mass graves, that sort of thing. So what we're finding is that we've spent a lot of time talking about a particular technology, whether it be standard media or the social media, but there's another layer of technology on top of that is starting to emerge, from remote sensing satellites to open source geographical information systems like Ushahidi being used with Syria Tracker to try to crowdsource, to map what's going on. So there are all kinds of layers of technologies that are emerging that may or may not address some of this access issue, but at least that's going on. At least that is something that we're beginning to see used.
But I just want to take a step back, Stephen, to I'm sure some patriotic Twitter user is already actively creating this campaign against you. A professor from George Washington University has, on the record, compared the U.S. military's media operation to the Islamic State. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I don't think
you
just heard me correctly.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm not sure that's what I said. Very much so, yes. There was a question out of Paris, though.
Sorry there.
No, I was just going to say, I thought the one issue that we're missing here, I suppose, is just however much we can report on what's going on in Iraq or in Syria. We live in a tremendously visual age, and we see this all the time, that if you can't have images to illustrate your journalism, be it video images or photo images, you hit a bit of a dead wall. And I think that's one of the huge challenges with reporting the Islamic State. And that's why people inevitably delve into some of the less offensive Islamic State images, such as the parades and so on in Raqqa. I think there's a desperate need, literally, to illustrate news reports, be it online or on the television.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for taking the time to engage in this lively conversation. And sorry for giving you so much shit, Stephen. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank Steve Livingston, Santiago Lyon, Lena Khatib, and Phil Chetwin for joining our panel today. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. The show is over, but we want this conversation to continue. So please tweet at us, at Vice News on Skype, and check out our videos on YouTube. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Thanks, guys.